clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen as my dad starts cooking delicious Chinese delicacies from his hometown, Tianjin, China. Without needing measurement cups or scales, my dad knows every dish by heart, and I always pounce on these meals made from soy sauce, Chinese vinegar, chili peppers, and of course, as opposed to the Cajun trinity, what one could call the Chinese trinity, cong, jiang, suan, or onion, ginger, and garlic. These are all crucial ingredients to making any tasteful meal, whether that's my dad's sizzling golden brown bala or his simmering flavorful taibu or sweet and sour ribs. However, other than delicious Chinese food, the most important element my parents gave me was their heritage language. Because they insisted on developing my Chinese ability since I was young, I stand here today able to speak Zhongwen and truly embrace my culture. Over nightly dinners, for instance, I can ask my parents for family lore or gossip with my dad, while also connecting with others in the broader Chinese community. However, not all immigrant families living inside the United States are like mine. There are some where immigrant children can't speak their heritage language because of preconceived notions buried in their parents' and society's minds. Without a common language, these children can lose the flavor of their rich and immersive culture. It can also make it difficult to communicate their feelings or talk about general worries. And to take a closer perspective, we're going to look at the feeling wheel, which shows a timeline for children's vocabulary development. If we look inside the wheel, we see basic terms for emotions like happy or sad. But if we branch out, we start acquiring more advanced words like inquisitive or inferior that better describe how we're truly feeling. Imagine an immigrant child, for instance, who's struggling in school and needs to reach out for help. Suppose they aren't proficient in their heritage language. In that case, the most they'll probably be able to say in that language is that they're fearful about school without using a word like overwhelmed to truly describe what they need. Without this crucial and specific vocabulary, it can be difficult for children to convey worries to their parents, who are generally a child's primary support system. So, what happens when an immigrant child doesn't know their heritage language? What do they do if they can't use literal words to articulate how they're feeling? This rupture of language challenges normal communication boundaries and can make it difficult for children to go to their parents. Take the Tao family, for example. Lin Tao, the eldest child in this family, conducted a study on the language differences within generations. When they moved from Vietnam to the United States, Lin and her sister retained their Vietnamese, while their younger siblings struggled and eventually only spoke English. When talking to parents or grandparents who didn't know English, Lin and her sister had to translate for their younger siblings about their school or personal lives. This transfer of roles disrupted the usual parent-child balance as older children got more responsibility and also gradually drifted away from their parents. On the other hand, younger siblings also found it difficult to force and form deeper connections with their family because of their heavy reliance on their older siblings. Personally, I've assumed this adult role in my life before. As a child, my parents always beckoned me to ask blue-vested workers where certain grocery items were or to resolve customer service issues because they believed my English was superior to theirs. Despite feeling betrayed that I suddenly grew up compared to my peers, I could voice my frustration and thoughts to my parents in Chinese. However, for immigrant children who can't do so, their family has to maneuver around this language barrier. And one way the Tao parents and grandparents did so was through the language of food. If you've ever watched Asian shows or seen Asian parents, there is often the archetype of a distant but caring parent or grandparent who expresses their love through cut fruit or heaping dinner portions. Personally, whenever I'm casually studying or reading, I'll see a plate piled with freshly washed fruit sneak up on the table. Since one of my mom's love languages is fruit, I often get showered with apples, grapes, anything of the sort. And when my friends come over, they're always surprised when whole gardens spring up in bowls. However, as scrumptious as this love may be, food can't replace the critical role that languages play within a family. Children still need to be able to communicate their thoughts, feelings, and overall well-being without having to worry about what words or language to use. The question to ask next is, how did we as Americans get here? To this point where so many immigrant children don't know their heritage language. Well, because of how America was founded, English has always been known as the unofficial official language of the United States. After all, it's embedded in every walk of life, from restaurant menus to road signs. And though we can see how English plays this dominant role, we've lost sight of just how many languages live within the United States. What you may not know is that according to the United States Census Bureau, in 2019, approximately 22% of American families spoke a language other than English. That's about 1 in 5 families, which is a sizable proportion, considering that America is known as the melting pot of cultures. However, simultaneously, there was a 29% increase in English-only speakers, which shows his reverence for English that can negatively affect immigrant families and heritage languages. In fact, until the 1960s, there were studies conducted showing that bilingualism was harmful to children's learning capacities. With these studies that were eventually proven false, the general public latched onto them to support their prejudiced claims. They started enforcing the belief that immigrant children would only be successful if they solely spoke English and gave up on their heritage languages. There are also instances in the news where immigrants have been berated for speaking their heritage language because it's un-American and are told to speak English instead. Though we need English to survive in this society, we shouldn't burden immigrant parents to assimilate and give up their heritage language because languages can coexist at the same time. On the other side of the problem are immigrant children who are similarly affected with societal perceptions, especially at school. How the language curriculum is structured can determine whether or not an immigrant child wants to adopt and retain their heritage language. If, for instance, teachers ignore the fact that their students may speak different languages than others or may have different home lives than others, it may create a sense that America should be this homogeneous society full of English speakers. With this mindset, some children may treat others who look different, act different, or speak different languages from them harshly. And these targeted students will in turn do what children do best and try to blend in with their peers by rejecting anything that makes them stand out, including, unfortunately, their immigrant family. Let's travel to the 20th century Louisiana classroom when education did just that. Some of us are familiar with how Cajun French is dying in Louisiana because of the harsh and cruel punishments teachers enacted on students for speaking French. This is a prime example of linguistic genocide, where language dies within a population because of oppressive outside forces. In Louisiana, a 1921 constitution effectively forbid the use of French in all public schools. To enforce this law, teachers began utilizing forms of corporal punishment, including hitting the backs of their students' hands with rulers or forcing them into isolation. Some even subjected them to writing "I will not speak French" hundreds of times. As schools suppressed French, these Cajun students became parents themselves, who had a fear that their students and their children would face the same humiliation and punishment that they did, began to speak the language less and less. As a result, generation after generation, the language died out. Now many people don't speak the language that their ancestors once spoke, and the language that gave to so many rich cultural areas in Louisiana. However, there have been many efforts to preserve and promote the Cajun culture, including the first French Indigenous Immersion School and festivals like Festival Acadians in Lafayette. The movement to preserve and promote cultures comes with the greater societal realization of family's importance and the role that heritage languages play in fostering familial relations. There have also been studies on bilingualism's benefits, including increased cognitive abilities and reduced chance for Alzheimer's. As for me, learning Chinese has been such a fundamental part of discovering who I am. I can better understand my background and identity through all the avenues of culture my parents brought me, whether that was traveling to China multiple times or subjecting me to weekend Chinese, which was even too much school for me. However, I can text in Chinese using the helpful guidance of emojis and converse with my parents in colloquial phrases. Looking back at all my 18 years of life, I'm still most proud of myself for being bilingual in an environment where monolingualism is dominant. Now, with this insight into how an immigrant family is structured, I bring you my own trinity to address, similar to the Cajun or Chinese cooking trinity I mentioned earlier: immigrant parents, teachers and educators, and my general audience. To immigrant parents, I urge you to understand how bilingualism is benefiting your children today and how it will benefit them in the future. Though they might eventually learn English in school, they should be able to learn their heritage language so that whenever they venture back to your home country or want to speak to a family member, they feel comfortable enough to do so. To teachers and educators, I urge you to reflect on how you frame linguistic attitudes in your classroom to be welcoming and appreciative of those who are multilingual by incorporating diverse sources or characters. And finally, to the masses, I urge you to have empathy and open-mindedness for immigrant families, because after all, learning a language can be extremely difficult. Though we don't have to be as extreme as John Cena and go to a whole other country to get a sweet treat, we need to recognize that children shouldn't be deprived of learning and accepting such a fundamental part of who they are because of our actions. However, please also have empathy and patience for any family, including your own. We don't always know what people are feeling or thinking, but with a common language, whether that's a heritage language or English, we can try and better understand. Even though I know Chinese, I'll never know what's truly running in my parents' minds, but when they bring out the rolling pin, the metal bowl full of vibrant dumpling filling, and the bamboo mats, I know it's time to watch flour coat the air in my dad's hands, expertly full of dumplings. As this monthly tradition continues, I think back to myself on how grateful I am to be so closely tethered to my culture and feel right at home as my parents converse in Chinese. I want you, whether you're an immigrant child or not, to be able to find belonging within your own lives. So I ask you, how can you use the language you know to develop closer relations within your family and 真实讲述你的故事, or speak true to your story?